Hi friends, welcome to Raising Lifelong Learners. I'm your host, Colleen Kessler, and this is the podcast where I encourage you to trust yourself and your differently wired kiddos as you help cultivate their curiosity, encourage them to discover the world around them, embrace who they are wired to be, all while helping them discover their passions, interests, and raise them to become the amazing adults they're meant to be. Hey, welcome back. This is episode 256, and I am so excited about today's episode. I have been dying to get my friend Lydia Rosado on to talk all about her amazing unit studies and her method for teaching her kids and all of the things she does. Lydia is a longtime friend and listener, and she has this gorgeous Instagram account, Happily Caffeinated After, a caffeine addict right after my own heart. And she is such a master at following her kiddos' interests and encouraging them to dive deeply into their passions. And today's conversation was just so rich and wonderful, all about how we can see, observe, notice our kids and what they're interested in, and then fuel those flames so they ignite and allow them to do amazing things. Check it out because, first of all, you're going to get lots and lots of great nuggets and wisdom from this, but also because Lydia has offered very generously a free movie guide download for all listeners, and you're going to love it. You're not going to want to miss it because it is something you can use with any movie when your kids want to watch and count it as school. Fabulous. All right. We will get right on with today's episode after this word from our sponsor. Are you a homeschooling parent with a child struggling with reading, writing, or spelling? Lexercise can help. Their online platform offers self-paced learning and expert instruction customized to your child's needs, all based on the Orton-Gillingham approach. We used Lexercise back when Logan was first diagnosed with dyslexia when she was, 8 or 9. And oh my goodness, the personalized support they gave us, the attention to detail, the program itself was just incredible. And Logan grew leaps and bounds. I'm so proud to have them as a sponsor for the podcast right now because more people need to know about their services. You can join thousands of families who have seen effective results, including mine, and have unlocked their child's love of learning. Visit Lexercise.com/learners for a free learning disabilities screener and to learn more about their programs. Check them out and let me know what you think. Ask me if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer them or direct you to my contacts at Lexercise. But if you have a kiddo who struggles with reading, writing, or spelling, you definitely want to check out Lexercise.com/learners and see what they can offer you. All right, let's get on with today's episode. All right, I am so excited actually about this podcast today because I met my guest years and years ago at a homeschooling conference, and I think that we just had this instant connection. We were instantly friends, and we have kept in touch forever, and I absolutely adore her. Lydia Rosado is here today to talk with me about just like the amazing homeschooling she does, the eclectic, interest-led stuff that happens at her house, and just all the other rabbit trails our conversation takes us on. Lydia, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I am so excited. Like I said, this is going to be a good one because I seriously could just talk to you all day, every day, and I don't think we'd run out of things to say.
No, not at all. We, in fact, have chatted quite a bit, and we never do run out of things to say.
No, not at all. Okay, why don't you take a minute and introduce yourself to listeners so they know who you are, a little bit about your background, how many kids you have, all of that good stuff.
I am an Air Force wife, and we are a military family, and for 20 years, actually. We move every few years, and we actually just completed another move. We are settling into our new state, new area of the country, and trying to enjoy some summer. But I have 4 kids, 15, 13, 11, and those are my boys, and then a 9-year-old girl. We began homeschooling after 2 years of public school. That just didn't go well. And so we had to figure out a new plan, and everything went wrong. And I learned to basically throw out everything I was taught heard about and figure out what worked for us. And so since then we've been and you have been a huge part of that, like encouraging the interest led and the rabbit trails. And so that's just what we've done, as well as embracing who we are, who my kids are, and playing to those strengths. And that's about it. We move, we read books, we move again, we go on adventures, and that's pretty much our homeschool.
I love that. And actually, your story is very similar to ours with that starting out and after a couple of years realizing this is not going to work and almost kicking and screaming, pulling them out under duress and then figuring it out as you went along. Because we had a similar story with removing Trevor from first grade in February and then none of the other kids going to school. Tell me a little bit more about that because you have quirky kids too. So tell me a little bit about,
Yes.
without going into detail about like specific kids by name, like what kinds of things, challenges you face in the day-to-day homeschooling. So then we can go into why the stuff that you do has worked so beautifully.
I'll back up to when before we went to public school. We had a military move in a really weird time of year that was not normal. And so I decided to homeschool my oldest for kindergarten because I was like, I can't screw that up. And then I'll just stick him in school later. And it was such a fun, wonderful year. And we just learned together and read books and did projects and experiments. And my kid loved it. Like he just thrived. And then I took him into public school. And the funny thing is he started crying every morning, asking me to homeschool him again because he wasn't learning. He wasn't learning what he wanted. He wasn't learning anything. He just had to sit there. And then he'd come home and he would struggle with behavior because he just sat there. So after a couple of years, we took him out with a new move somewhere else. And my husband was all on board because of where we were moving, was not going to have good schools. And so we started homeschooling. And this time he bucked at me big time. This kid who had been reading adult encyclopedias in first grade suddenly didn't want to learn anything. It's almost like happened in public school taught him learning was not fun. And for him, he wouldn't do anything. So he begged me to homeschool and then we homeschooled and then he said no. So that was really hard because I didn't know what to do because that's not what was supposed to happen. We were supposed to homeschool and it was supposed to be delightful and fun and exciting and joyful. And instead, we fought and fought. And so the turning point came, and this is important to our story because this is when I started to recognize what homeschooling could be with my kids. Is I told him so frustrated one day, okay, fine, don't write anything, don't pick up a pencil, just don't, and I'm not going to pester you. And his jaw like dropped to the floor and said, are you for real? I said, yeah, I'm not going to ask you to write anything. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to forget all the worksheets and workbooks and whatever else. Just don't. All I'm asking is that you listen when I read. And so he was like, okay. And he didn't. It was probably a year and a half until he decided to do something with a pencil again. But through reading, we were reading about the Revolutionary War, and I'll never forget. I heard them playing outside, and I heard him do a G-rated version of an Ethan Allen quote, which was "Out, you rats," because that's what we had read about. And so I thought, oh my goodness, he is learning something. And my kids, my other boys were a part of that reenactment, the role playing. He asked to make a cardboard rifle so he could have a prop to play. And I realized at that point, thinking back to what we had done kindergarten year, that this was just a progression of that. And that everything that public school for him had been needed to just get washed out of him so that he didn't have those memories. So at that point, I was like, cool, let's just read books. Let's see what we can do. You want to do this project? Yeah, let's do it. I'll figure out a way. And that's pretty much what we do to this day. In fact, you want to learn about that? Great. Let's find books. Do you have any projects in mind? Sure, we can do that. A big mess? Okay. Yes, that's what my house is now. But I think it was just this turning point because he was so gifted in language arts, and that's what he refused to do. He just didn't want to do it. So he went from early reading and doing this incredible stuff in school to I will not, and hating it all. However, once he came back, you can't stop him. This kid that I promised didn't never had to write another word writes stories and essays and research papers and all of this stuff and reads Ivanhoe on his own by choice. So it's not, his story had to develop at his pace and with his interests. And this, so he was really the turning point because he was my oldest and he was leading the crowd. But for him, he's gifted, and that became a problem with school. And I didn't know how to teach that. My next son actually has a lot of learning differences, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. And so suddenly, instead of rushing with the oldest, I'm slowing it down with the next one. But he's so gifted in art, and
Yes.
that's how he's so gifted. And so he creates through art, and that's how he processes his learning. And that's really why homeschooling works well, is he can draw it out and show what he's learning and go at his pace and his interests. And I don't have to fight with him on, well, please do this. Because, I mean, he started his school year already because he wants to. Like, how many kids say, cool, I finished up, I took a week off to move, and now I want to learn some more. Mm-hmm. But that's what he's doing, his choice. Trust me, I would not choose that for this particular summer. But so yeah, so he's so gifted in one area and really struggles in another, but he's really made slow and steady progress and loves books. And I don't think he would if he had stayed in public school. He did kindergarten in public school, but I don't think he would still love to read if he had stayed. And I don't think they would have focused on his art the way that we do.
Right.
So that's been good for homeschooling with us. My third son cannot sit still, cannot sit in a chair. He's 11 and we still have problems. But he's been able to he's always built things, mostly with cardboard and recycling and trash. Can I go out to the trash bin is not something, it is something I hear all the time. Can I go look through the trash? Sure. Yes, you may. Please wash your hands afterwards. But then through all of that, he discovered he loved blacksmithing. And so we've just been able to find really interesting passions that each one of them has by letting them just develop at their pace.
I love that. There's a couple things that you said that I want to touch on really quickly, because I think that the first one, I don't think people talk about enough. And I think it's important to note when you said the homeschooling was not sunshine and roses in that early part, when you hit that second round and it was not fun for any of you. You were all frustrated. But what happened? You didn't give up and put them back in school. You easily could have, and you wouldn't have been faulted for it in any way, shape, or form. But just that pushing through and finding a different way, a different approach, lent itself to you finding this path that's been so beautiful, because you were able and willing to take a step back and say, okay, this isn't working. It's not the homeschooling that's not working. It's what we're doing right now. And I think that so many of us, we were talking actually a little bit about this before, it's an aside, but that idea when a homeschooling mom gets overwhelmed, that people around her naturally say, well, just put your kids in school because it'll be so much easier. And as Lydia and I were talking about before we came on the air, that doesn't solve the problem. It just creates other problems, right? When you've got neurodivergent kids or quirky kids or differently wired kids in any way, shape, or form, whatever you want to call them, when they don't fit the box, it doesn't matter where you try to put them. They're going to be outliers anyway. So sticking with it and trusting that the process of homeschooling works, because you are all in for your kid, and then finding a different way, I think is a beautiful testimony kind of to what you were describing there.
That's totally it. No matter where you put that box, they're not going to fit in it if they don't fit in a box, unless they're cutting it up to create something that they use to cut up and create. But I think I had to learn to recognize that there's an opportunity with what you want to do. It doesn't fit my plan, but there's an opportunity with what you want to do. My third son was obsessed with the live action movie Aladdin, which I didn't really enjoy, but I was like, okay. And he said, he didn't use the words a set design, but that's what he wanted to make. He wanted to make what he saw in the movie. And so we did. And through that, we talked about the setting of the movie, the characters, the plot arc, how the setting helps the story, how it's important to the story with the Cave of Wonders and the palace versus the opposite, the bazaar and the marketplace. We learned about the culture of this fictional Middle Eastern town. We learned about all of these things through him saying, I love this movie. We even examined the words of the lyrics and did some copy work with that so that he could understand all of the vocabulary. Because in a lot of the old Disney movies, the vocabulary is incredible.
Yeah, agreed.
And it's clever, it's funny, it's really much higher than a children's level of vocabulary is. And so we did all of this because he liked the movie. Because I said, okay, that wasn't on my plan, but I see that we can use what you want to do. We talked about symmetry because in Middle Eastern architecture, there's a lot of symmetry. So you take this, and then he created this amazing cardboard, paper mache set design of the market bazaar, the palace, and the Cave of Wonders, which we kept and moved across the country quite a few times so that he could play. I finally said, I don't think this is going to make it one more move. And we just got rid of it like this past spring.
That's amazing. That's incredible. I love that. And I just love that the lesson that's in there when one of the common questions I get, because you've followed me for years and we've talked for years, I'm a huge proponent of following your kids' interests and passions and getting to know who your kid is and collectively making those decisions to guide how your homeschool is going to run. And sometimes that, depending on the type of kid you have, that might feel like it's backfiring. Like you mentioned earlier, your kiddo who's very gifted linguistically and in language arts was not wanting to do any of that. But then getting even deeper underneath there to find those little sparks and fan those can just benefit you so much, because you really can bring a lot in when you focus on what a kid is interested in, and then you don't have to follow a typical textbook or whatever. I was having a conversation with my daughter actually about this yesterday, because she just started taking a college class. She's taking one over the summer, and it's not one she's super interested in. It was one that fit the schedule, essentially, and will benefit her eventually. Like, I know as a parent, like, this is a good foundation to have. But as she was talking and she was trying to formulate the structured discussion board response in the way that fit the rubric, she was very frustrated and was like, I can't do this. I don't know how to do school like this. And then she was lamenting that she was so far behind all her friends and her peers and whatever. And when we finally stepped back, we were able to examine all the things she knows and has learned from the perspective of her theater and the plays that she's read, the plays that she's written, the journal entries that she's made, the books that she's read, the conversation she's had. She's got a really close friend with whom she analyzes movies all the time, like deep level, totally gifted individual conversations about the films that they're watching. A really good intellectual peer for her. And I said, all you're doing is taking the same stuff that you've always talked about and formulating it so it checks the boxes of the rubric. It's just a restructuring of how you've always talked, how you've always thought, what you've always read for. And so now you need to learn the lesson you essentially need to learn in this class is how to package it so that a professor feels that you've met, their checkoffs. She's not behind. And when we sat down and really talked about all she's learned in her however many years she's just finished her 11th grade year of homeschooling, she's actually ahead but needed to see that approach was different, but the learning that was accomplished is so much richer, deeper. It's more set, like in their gut, right? Because he learned, for example, with your son, he learned symmetry and the beauty of the architecture within the context of something he loved. So it's going to be more meaningful. And if he takes an art history class later in college, or he takes an architecture class or whatever, that's going to come out and he's going to be able to discuss it in a richer way. He might have to step back a little bit and formulate a written response in a more structured approach than he'd like, but articulately, he's able to share his thoughts in a much richer way.
It's totally about the packaging. I come from a public school mindset. And so it was hard for me to not do it that way. But then you start seeing how much they can learn through anything
Mhm.
and how much you can bring into that particular interest. And then you realize, okay, you know this stuff. So the game is to fit it into what else, what the person wants. And honestly, I do remember playing that game in college.
Yeah.
What does this professor want? And how can I do that? And you do it with bosses too in the workplace. They want it this way. That's not hard. I just have to remember to do it that way.
Right.
But the knowledge is so much more embedded in their being and informs who they become because of the rich learning that they did. And it's funny because now, so the kid that's really linguistically gifted, what got him back into learning was horses.
Mm.
He wanted to ride horses. And so we found him a farm to work at. He worked and then he got a lesson, which helped with the price. And I provided him with lots of horse books, which some he loved the nonfiction ones, ditched all the rest of them, except the Middle Ages. He loved knights because knights had horses, but then he learned about knights. And so we did this whole unit study of knights and everything that we could to incorporate it. And I read alouds to all of my kids at that point, not the baby, but I read the read alouds to everybody, and everybody enjoyed it. And we talked about it. We just had lots of good discussions. Now, fast forward, and he's watching Lord of the Rings and recognizing things. We read Narnia, and he understood some of the things in how some of the mythology of Arthur and Camelot kind of plays into some mythology of Narnia. We continue to develop that. And now this summer, he picked up Ivanhoe and said, yeah, I think I'm going to write this. I read this. I think this will help the fantasy story I've been writing. And then I read his story and I recognize the language that he's been reading incorporated because it makes sense. And so this kid who loved horses, who loved the Middle Ages, he now is back there years later. And I just see how this is going to be something that he's always going to love and it will always inform who he is. And he has an incredibly strong right or wrong. There's no gray. It's very hard for him to ever see a gray. It's black or white. And I think all of that goes with the idea of the code of chivalry. And we do talk about the difficulties of that time and all of the confusion and all of the complexity that goes with that. However, I see him as a knight fighting evil because that's truly what he got out of that is you're supposed to stand up and stand against evil. So all of these things that at the time, and at the time for the most part, I was just shoving books, getting books from the library and leaving them out and letting him find them. And then he would take them up to his room and I had no idea what he was doing because he was just unhappy with life at that time. And so I just let him have some space. And then after some space, he joined us and we all did our thing together. But I think if he hadn't been able to figure it out on his own terms through his own interest, he might be a very different kid today. And we just talk about the packaging of it. And it's the same information that I wanted to give him, but he didn't want it because it wasn't in a way that he could receive it at the time. And it's not that you always need to cater. And trust me, there have been plenty of times I have not catered to him.
Absolutely.
But you just have to use discernment as to when is the time to go ahead and when is the time to be a little tougher on the no. I said it's this. We're going to do that.
Yeah.
But
yeah, that's a challenge. And I think that's a challenge for any homeschool mom. Like, where's the line between stepping back or pushing? And how do I navigate wanting to feed their passions and interests, but still knowing that there are some foundational things that they need to know? And I think for every parent, this is not the answer most homeschooling parents want. Like, they want, tell me what I need to do.
yes.
But the truth is, it's very different for every family. It's even different within a family. I've got 4 kids, and there's at least one who took a break from certain subjects that are that are very concept based for a few years. And then there are others that I'm like, nope, you need to do a math lesson 2-3 times a day because you need to keep moving and they're short and whatever. And so you really just have to know your kids. Okay, I'm going to ask you a practical question because
Mm.
I know you get this, and I know that it comes up a lot when you're talking to people about following interests or doing more creative unit studies or hands-on projects and things like that. So there's actually a couple pieces that that we get asked a lot, is that the whole mess thing, and the short answer really is you just have to embrace it.
Yeah.
But the idea that sometimes kids like get tired of things, right? So how do you approach that when they get tired of it? But then also, because I want to talk about both and we'll see where it takes us. Also, what about when you do have four kids and they have all different interests? Like, how do you navigate the passion and the interest? And then maybe it doesn't take and they're tired of it, but then also maybe it's not taking for one or two and they all want to study different things. How can you even logistically implement a unit study, interest led, more creative approach to your homeschooling without spending all of your time planning things and pulling resources and spending a boatload of money? How is that even possible? You've got four.
Yeah, I sure do. And that's an awesome question. I would say for us, we've decided that family learning is something that usually I want them to know, or quite a few of them have expressed interest in. So, for instance, I decided one year I felt like we hadn't done enough science in
Mhm.
our homeschool. Just over the years, it's been intimidating to me. I don't know how to do it. And I realized quickly, oh, snap, my oldest is about to go to seventh grade, and I don't really know what he knows. He could know nothing for all I know. So I decided that year would be the year of biology, life sciences, basically. Let's learn about animals because you can do a lot of scientific concepts, and it felt doable for me. So for family learning, I picked the read aloud, but I picked the first one based off of a region one of my other kids was interested in. And I picked a classic book for my oldest because he likes classics. So we chose The Jungle Book and Just So Stories. And so we're all reading the same thing, but one of them got a lot more out of it as he said, oh, can I read this animal book and go this direction? Yes, you can, because that's not on my time. And the other one said, I would love to draw these animals. Great, go for it. And then my third son, who's always building, said, he didn't say this. And I said to him, hey, why don't you build a habitat for whichever animal you would like to? Because it's the Jungle Book. Wolves do not exist in the jungle. So what's the actual habitat? Let's figure this out. And so at that point, all three of them are listening to the same stories. We're doing the same, like in some ways, the same animal lessons, but each one of them caught on to a different part of it. And so I let that go, let them have the time. And I think that's a big thing right there: time, space, resources. It's not going to kill my budget to get a bunch of books from the library,
Right.
which I do all the time. I do keep a lot of art supplies, but it's not like I just shopped for them all at once. They come up as projects come up, and someone says, hey, we just ran out of this color, or hey, can we go to the dollar store and see what might work for XYZ? Yeah, sure. So we just collect these things so that when someone says, hey, I want to build this diorama of whatever habitat it was, I don't even remember. Can I do that? Yeah, sure. I think it was mangrove forest. Then we have tissue paper and trash bags and all of paints and all of this stuff. And it's like their projects are where they really get to express the passions that they have. And I leave lots of time. And honestly, I can read while they do those projects. And that tends to be what happens. They come to the table. We do a lot of our schooling around the dining room table. They come to the table prepared to sit, or if you're my youngest son, to wiggle and be on the floor, but working on something quietly. And for them, that's how it's always worked. So it's been one topic explored through many different avenues based on who was interested in what and what their passions are and what their strengths are. We wrote our own Just So story, because my oldest loves to write. You can do that where my middle son said, ooh, I could do this story and illustrate it. Then suddenly he's writing, even though writing's hard for him. And I told my oldest, you don't have to illustrate it if you don't want to. So you have ways to play to their strengths and do that. Also, my third son hates writing, but he'll tell me a story and I'll write it down. So
Mm-hmm.
while the other two are working, I can help him do that. So I think for me, it's noticing where their interests and passions lie, and how can a project be that example of learning in a physical way? Because people like to see evidence, right? Evidence of something that they've learned. And I'm not as much interested in that, except that my kids love them. They love projects like this. But it shows me what they've learned and how they go about it. I can see the research, or I can see the thought process that goes into something. I'm looking at the pictures, looking, especially if they're doing something art-wise. So that's one way, is you can just choose a topic, but let your kids choose how they show and demonstrate their learning. And that can be really powerful and a great way to hit all of the different kids while keeping it very doable for you. And also, I will say, I don't plan a lot. I don't, because I know someone's going to come up with a way better idea of something, or it's just going to be a spur of the moment. Oh my goodness, we should do that. And then the kids usually feed off of that excitement and say, yes, we should. And it's a lot better than if I had this planned whatever and said, no, I'm sorry, we can't do that, even though it sounds really cool because I had this planned for today. So
Right.
I tend to, and that always made me feel guilty, not getting to the things we didn't get to.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just was like, why do I even plan? How about I just not? I can write down stuff that we do later on, or I can look at it as a suggestion page. Options if I need an option. Otherwise, just go with the flow.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that a lot of school parents get nervous about that. But depending on who your family is and how they're wired, you might need to adjust. And sometimes that's having a general idea of what kinds of topics you want to explore and maybe what kinds of outcomes you want, whether that's just you want them to understand, okay, like a certain level of critical thinking throughout this process, or a certain understanding of a time period in history throughout this, or why this habitat or this like climate is different than the one in which they live.
Mm-hmm.
But then how they get there can be up to them. And you can, exactly what you said, do that kind of like backward planning approach where you then go and jot down the things you did end up doing throughout the day and take like a journaling approach, a reflective approach, right? As teachers, like you said, you have the public school background, and I come from teaching in a classroom and then teaching gifted kids in resource rooms with projects. And we're taught as teachers to be reflective about what we're teaching and what we're doing so that we can make improvements the next time we teach that unit or whatever. It's very similar to when I'm saying plan backwards, it's very similar to that idea of reflect on what actually was accomplished today and what lessons came out of it. Because here's the thing, to any mom listening, right? And this, Lydia, because you've been doing it for so long, when you jot down the things that you actually did or the things that the insights your kids have made, you will be floored by how much they've actually done and learned. There are so many days that I can look back on in my homeschooling, because this is our 15th or 16th year. I don't know, it like all blurs together.
Mm-hmm.
And there are so many days that I can think about feeling just horrible at the end of it. Like I didn't do anything with my kids. But then when I would challenge myself to stop and actually jot down some of the things we did or analyze what we talked about, even, we covered a whole range of topics and insights and interests and skills and concepts without even realizing we were learning. One of my kids, my youngest actually, tells people all the time that he just doesn't do school. He just does math because he doesn't associate anything else he does with school. And while that's good, it's also bad because other people don't get that as much. And it's probably why many people just think he plays Roblox all day long. But he actually has an incredibly deep well of knowledge on a whole range of different topics. So if you've been a listener of the podcast for a while, you've heard me talk about CTC Math for the last couple of years. They have been supportive sponsors of the podcast. And as I've told you before, I'm a customer. My kids use CTC Math in their homeschool. I am a paying subscriber and have been for a number of years, even before CTC sponsored the podcast. I am a raving fan, and I will continue talking about their resources and their program until long after I'm done homeschooling, because I think it's really versatile for so many different types of families, whether your kids are super strong in an area or super weak in an area of math. It allows you to customize their education when it comes to math. I've talked to so many families over the years, but I want to share with you a message that I received from Sandy, a longtime listener who was content in what they were using until, again, they weren't, and they switched over to CTC Math based on a recommendation that they'd heard on the podcast. Sandy writes, "We too started using CTC Math following your recommendation, Colleen. One of my sons is so dedicated. Then, after watching over his shoulder, my other son started using it too. They both now do an hour each workday by choice. I even enjoy it myself. I do the lessons with them, which is a handy brush up, and will occasionally do some of the algebra lessons ahead of time. Math was not my strong suit in school, but now I love it, and I wish the program had been available in the 80s. Too many people think they're terrible at math, but I truly believe we all just need a method of learning that suits us. CTC Math seems to work for all three of us." So check out ctcmath.com or go to the link over in the show notes for this episode and click on it to go over there and see the offer that they have for podcast listeners. You don't have to just take my word for it. You can take Sandy's as well. CTC is a great program and could be a wonderful benefit for your homeschool. All right, let's get back to today's episode.
Absolutely. So for that Just So stories and the Jungle Book, so we covered science and nature. We covered literature. We did poetry because we brought out Kipling's The Poem If, which led us to, when did he write that? Oh, look, there's some more history because it was from when he lost his son in World War I. Then you look at India and colonialism and why was Kipling so interested in India? So then you learn about that. There are so many directions that you can go. You're learning about the geography, you're learning about the landscape, and then you're learning about different formations of landscape and all of that. So when you stop and think about what you're doing in that area, that one topic that you've chosen, I don't think people quite realize how many subjects you can include completely easily, so easily. We did folk art, we drew art, we analyzed the book through discussion, and it wasn't difficult. It was just conversational. And I'm not going to lie, I get help from the internet sometimes with my analyzing and literary information. There are a lot of free guides out there. Mm-hmm. And I might look at it ahead of time just to have an idea of what's coming up in this book, or what are the highlights or the themes or things I could pay attention to, because I am a busy mom and I don't always have time to pre-read or make notes or study it myself. And I often say that I wing it in my homeschool. What's your style? I wing it. That's pretty much it. But that doesn't mean I don't prepare or kind of use helps for myself. It just means I allow it to unfold, and I never know exactly what we've learned until the end. I can't predict it, because I think when I used to try to do that, I felt forced into the box.
Right.
And that if we started to go outside of that, then we weren't covering what we were supposed to be covering. And I just learned it doesn't matter. Like, you cover what you cover, and that's going to be really good, no matter what it is, whether you get to it all or not. And that's just how we approach things. And I think you can really tailor whatever unit study towards the weaknesses as well as the strengths to your kid. If they're weak with writing, like a couple of mine are, add some art into it. And suddenly, oh, the writing makes sense. We need to write to explain the art. Great, let's do that. Or the kid that's great at writing isn't as natural at art because the perfectionist tendencies are there, which means that art is great for him because he has to work through and appreciate the process rather than the perfect outcome. So I think there are a lot of ways that you can not just teach the stuff, but work on both the strengths and the weaknesses by just embracing, hey, here's our topic. What can we do with it? And that kind of attitude, which I think a lot of people don't really understand. That's literally what I do. Mm-hmm. I just say, hey, this book looks good, and I think we could cover this history or this science with it. Now let's see what we do.
Yeah.
What can we do?
I think that we tend to make things more difficult for ourselves, right? And that's just that's an easy way to do it. And it's one of the reasons I've always loved stalking your Instagram, and we're going to link to it, Happily Caffeinated After, which is like a name I could have made. because I rely heavily on
know.
caffeine. And just the things that you share and the resources and projects that your kids are working on are fabulous over there. Before we start wrapping up, I just want to mention Lydia sent me a film guide. I'm going to let her tell about it in a second here over to share with you, just as her gift to you. Because just like there's so many different things you can do with books, there's so many different things that you can do with movies, and it's an underutilized resource, I think, in homeschooling because we're afraid that it's frivolous. And that will be over on the show notes page. You can get a download link to it by just, there'll be a form over there. You can fill in your name and it'll be emailed to you. But one of the reasons I love it so much when I glanced through it when she first sent it over to me is because two of my kids in particular learned so much through film and video. My oldest, I remember before he graduated, so he's 21, and his last couple of years of high school, we approached, because history was his weaker area, just because he didn't care about history and he didn't want to be bothered. And so I realized, like you with the year of science, that he doesn't have enough background in what's gone on in our country to go out into the world and talk confidently about how the past is impacting the future and vice versa, and or the present. And we had a couple textbooks and we made up the idea to cover a unit a day, a unit a week. And he'd read for 2 days, read the unit over 2 days, watch videos related to that unit over 2 days. And then on Friday, we'd meet for coffee and we'd talk about the units and the concepts. There was so much he got from the videos he watched that we didn't need a product. Like that particular kid doesn't need a product, and the conversation was product enough to me at that point. But I am blown away constantly by how much my daughter, my 16-year-old daughter, knows, because she's a musical theater actress, but she loves all medium of the arts, especially films and plays. And that's from popular movies. She likes horror movies. She likes romantic comedies, as well as like classics or those deep thinking kind of artsy films. And when she watches and analyzes the insights and the connections she makes to other things she's read or done or seen or what's going on in the world are just fascinating. She was in a coaching call the other day. She's working with some different college admission coaches for the different aspects of the program she wants to get into. And I overheard this coach that she was meeting with for the first time. It's a monologue coach. She's pursuing a BFA in musical theater, which is a whole different animal than applying for colleges in general. And one of the questions, the monologue coach was trying to get to know her so she could get to know her motivation, so she could find good monologues to help match her up with. Mm-hmm. And one of the questions she asked, she said, I think I know the answer to this, but would you say like you're immature for your age or mature for your age and analytical or non-analytical? And she goes into her discussion, and then the monologue coach comes back and says, yeah, I would agree. You're very analytical and you have some really deep insights and a deeper level of understanding of the things that you're reading or you're viewing. And she sent her over just on a whim. It's not something she normally does in these consults. She sent her over a monologue to do a cold reading of, to see what her interpretation would be. And then she threw a completely different interpretation that she agreed does not actually make sense for what the story is about, but mm-hmm. wanted to see my daughter's acting take from that perspective on this piece that wasn't related to that perspective. And she did it because of her analytical brain and all of the films she's seen and all of the observations of the human existence and how humans think and interact. And there's so much you can get. So anyway, I'm really excited about this film study because it's a good way to jump off and take something that we all have access to. So can you tell us a little bit about that gift, Lydia?
Yeah. So I was a film studies minor in college.
Oh, you and Molly should talk, actually. I keep forgetting that.
Yeah. And so that's where a lot of this comes from, is I learned film. I mean, I was a film buff in general, and I loved old movies. And then in college, I took this and I realized, holy cow, this is an actual thing. This isn't just, because people used to laugh and say, oh, you're taking a movie class. And I'm like, you try taking this class. This professor is hard, because we weren't just reading like you would in English class. We were reading and watching multiple movies a week and comparing and contrasting and going deep and thinking about the culture and the history and learning all of that. So that's where I'm coming from. And I've always included movies in our unit studies. And with my high schooler this past year for ninth grade, World War I and World War II, I assigned him an elective of film studies because for the first time in modern history, you could see things that you couldn't for any other war. You could actually see what was happening, and there are clips, and then they made the movies right after. And that's, can you imagine like going through something like that and then possibly being an actor who fought and then redoing it again? And the whole culture, the whole world had experienced it, and now they're watching it. So this was a really new thing. So just like the printing press kind of changed the world and how we learn and communicate, films did that same thing for the modern era. And I think it's a really important thing to not dismiss, because you can look back on films and it's a reflection of the time in which they were made. You can easily spot a film from 1970s because not just the fashion, but because they have just an overall negative outlook on life. They all end badly, pretty much. Even the fun things. Have you seen the original Ocean's 11? Because that
Long time
ends
ago, yeah.
really not, or the Italian Job, those don't end well. They end really ambiguously and frustrating. Whereas the new ones from the 90s, those are fun when they end well. So for me, you should study film because you can glean so much from the culture and the time in which they were made instead of just watching it for the entertainment value. And if that's the case, then it's also a compass in some ways of pointing where are we heading? Because the first, some of the earlier film stars, people finally saw what they looked like and started copying their hairstyles. You have this, and you have these Rudolph Valentino, men started slicking their hairs back to be just like him from the silent era. And so you have people copying them. That means that means film studies, films are now directing where we're heading, what culture is going to be like. And I think a lot of the times people forget that. And I understand using wisdom and discernment in showing your kids films, but they're going to leave our house one day. And you're they're going to have to understand that not everything is for their good. And not everything is for my good. I don't want to see certain things in films. There are a lot of things that I shy away from and won't watch. But that's because I understand that not every film is going to have something that is good for me to watch. So I bristle at the idea that you can't include movies as part of homeschool, or that it only has to be a book and movie comparison, because I think it affects our world a lot more than we give it credit for. And to not give it credit takes away some of the power that as homeschoolers we have with our kids. Not power, but the influence, some of
Right.
the influence that we have. You leave them just assuming it's all okay or that it's all scary, instead of looking at it critically and saying, wait a second, there's a message. It's just like a book. There's a purpose and a message for every book. There's a purpose and a message for every movie. Is it what you think it is? And how does that make you feel? And how did we get there? And so you can do a lot of those same analytical practices that you do with books, with films. And I think that's an important skill as we go out and send our kids out into this world with all of the different messages, no matter what your belief system or viewpoint is, they're going to be bombarded by life.
For sure. Yeah, they are. So the study, if you go to the show notes page, it has discussion questions and it helps guide you through diving into any film you want. It can be used with anything. So it's really this valuable resource that you can download to your computer, save, and then use again and again. And I appreciate it. That was very sweet for you to give that to listeners. I'm sure that so many people will benefit from that. So thank you. That's amazing. Yeah. Okay, we really need to start wrapping up because, like I said before, I could probably talk to you forever and ever. Before we go and before I say goodbye, is there one thing, like whether we talked about it or we didn't and you would have wanted to, is there one thing that you would want to leave listeners with? Word of encouragement, some kind of tip, or just any other piece of information or advice about just homeschooling their differently wired kids that you think that either we didn't get to or you just want to reiterate as they're going forth in homeschooling?
I think as I look at my homeschool now versus what it has been, there's a lot of change as they get older. And it's not, it feels scary
And I think it feels scary because there's a lot of unknowns and because you hear that it's scary. The thing is, all of those messes and projects, all of the rabbit trails, all of them learning to use their strengths to learn something or to produce something or to practice those conversational skills. They ask for more independence when they're older. It's because they're ready for it. And it's like, it's hard for me to not have all of my kids in family time now.
Mhm.
However, it was really fun discussing movies with my oldest in comparison to the actual history or the books because of how culture works and all of this. It's fun watching my next son say, hey, I'd love to listen to the read alouds, but I don't want to do any of that stuff with you anymore because I want time to do my interest and passions. And I think we look at the high school years or my upper middle school, whenever that takes place, and we see that and say, oh, my kid will never get there, or, oh, how did they do that? And it's all of the little things, the messes, and teaching them to clean up, teaching them how to recognize personification by raising their hand every time they hear something that sounds like it. All of those things suddenly click, and they're off and running, determined. They're still doing interest led. It's just, it's on their own. Miss our time together, but at the same time, they come and talk to me still. You talked about meeting with your oldest son, and I kept meaning to have a time to do that. But then I thought, geez, Louise, this kid is constantly coming to me at dinner time, just telling me everything. I don't need that. We can just do it now. And so it becomes natural to them for their learning. And as you're cooking dinner and they learn to clean up, and when they don't, and you say, hey, remember, and they're, oh yeah. And then they clean up. But looking back, it's amazing to me how I see all of those things suddenly click, and I see the amazing results in high school as you're continuing to develop those next set of skills and things for whatever the goals might be, whether it's college or entrepreneurship. But don't be scared of high school. Instead, work on the thing that you're working on now. Do the thing you want. Enjoy the interest. Develop those passions and those strengths. There will always be weakness. I still have mine. Amen. There's always something learning. I'm still learning. But to see all of those little things now, looking back and seeing them still doing them, but just in a more mature way on their own, and you realize, oh, high school is doable. We can do this. It's pretty awesome. I'm so proud of them and all of my kids, but I'm proud of our homeschool and what it's become and how we can still hold on to those things that were important to us.
I love that. Yeah. Again, leading back to that idea of just trusting the process, because it doesn't matter how you do the whole homeschooling thing, as long as you're staying true to who your family is and trusting throughout. So amazing. Perfect. Okay. I mentioned your Instagram. Remind people of that and where else they can find you, because you just started something new.
Yes. So it's Happily Ever Caffeinated on Instagram. And then I started a Substack, also Happily Ever Caffeinated on Substack. And that's just where you can find more in-depth information about how I homeschool, what we're reading, what we're doing, even some mini unit studies. And just that's where I'm hoping to explain more and go into more detail, and maybe eventually put some more unit studies on there, film guides, got some other film guides in the works that if I could finish unpacking, I could get back to. But yeah.
That's perfect. I can't wait to see how that all develops and evolves. And we will link to both Lydia's Instagram and her Substack on the show notes page. Lydia, thank you so much for taking your time and hanging out with me today and sharing with listeners. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
Yeah. All right. Thank you all for listening. I know that there are so many different things that you can do with your time. There are so many podcasts out there and so much social media and other stuff to listen to and watch and take in. So I'm grateful that you spend a little bit of your time each day here or each week here. We'll be back next week, same time, same place, with another deep topic. In the meantime, though, you can find links to all of Lydia's stuff, the download link for the film guide, and then links to other resources related to interest-led homeschooling, helping to find your kids' strengths and passions, and all of the different stuff that we talked about today over on the show notes for this episode at raisinglifelonglearners.com/podcast. And as always, you can reach out on that show notes page. There's a contact form. There's a link to voicemail as well as the email link if you've got an idea for a topic, an idea for a guest, or you just want to tell us what you love learning about with your kids or how you like to fuel their interests and their passions. I'd love to hear it. All right. Have a great week. Enjoy your kids. Follow some interests and some passions and go on some adventures. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now.